Marcus Reed stepped into Delaney's market with an easy confidence, his well-tailored suit fitting him perfectly. He had a gentle smile, a successful black entrepreneur in his early 30s, known in the community for his generosity and leadership. Today, he wasn't there for business but to grab a few items for a charity event he was sponsoring. The store was quiet, with a handful of customers milling about, most of them elderly, their voices low as they exchanged pleasantries. Marcus had visited the store before, though never for anything more than a quick stop. He didn't expect anything to be out of the ordinary, but he was aware of the undercurrent of tension in the town, a small, predominantly white area where racial divides ran deep. As Marcus picked up a jar of peanut butter, he couldn't help but notice the store's owner, Frank Delaney, watching him from the counter. Frank, a man in his 60s, had seen a lot of changes in the town over the years, but his views on race had remained firmly fixed in the past. He had built his business around the idea of keeping things simple and clean, a philosophy that, in his mind, meant keeping out people who didn't fit his vision of what belonged. Frank didn't try to hide his suspicion as Marcus continued to shop. The older man's eyes narrowed, his gaze never straying far from Marcus's movements. He was no stranger to this sort of discomfort. He had seen the way some people looked at him in this town, the way they whispered when he entered places. But today, something in Frank seemed to snap. His patience wore thin as Marcus picked out some bread and a few other items. "You don't belong here." Frank's voice broke through the silence, abrupt and harsh. Marcus stopped in his tracks, raising his eyebrows in confusion. "I'm just shopping. I'm not causing any trouble," he said, his voice calm. Frank didn't seem to care. His hands tightened around the counter as he glared at Marcus. "We don't want trouble here. You should leave." Marcus's brow furrowed slightly, but he held his ground. "I don't want any trouble. I'm just here to grab some things and go." Frank's face reddened, his voice growing louder, drawing the attention of the few people in the store. "I said leave. You're not welcome here." The other customers, mostly older folks, exchanged uncomfortable glances, none of them willing to speak up. Marcus could feel the tension rising in the air, but he stood tall, refusing to be intimidated. "I'm not leaving. I'm just getting a few items. That's all." Frank's patience was at its breaking point. He stepped out from behind the counter, advancing toward Marcus, his voice cutting through the stillness. "You don't belong in my store. You're making a scene. Get out." Marcus held his ground, his voice steady. "I'm not leaving. Not until I've finished what I came to do." The confrontation drew out longer than Marcus expected. The other customers began to shift nervously, some glancing away, others shifting uncomfortably. Marcus remained calm, but Frank was insistent, becoming more aggressive with each passing second. "I said leave. I won't tell you again," Frank spat, now practically dragging Marcus toward the door. Marcus resisted, his anger rising but still controlled. "You can't just treat people like this. I'm a paying customer. I'm not a threat to anyone here." Frank's grip tightened, and with one final push, he shoved Marcus out of the store, slamming the door behind him. The few remaining customers watched in silence, too afraid to speak out. The situation felt like a ripple in a quiet pond, one that, though small in the moment, would soon send out waves. As Marcus walked away from the store, he could feel the sting of the humiliation, but he didn't react. He wasn't going to give Frank the satisfaction. It was a blow to his pride, but his dignity remained intact. He had bigger things to focus on. Inside the store, Frank stood by the counter, his face flushed with anger, but there was something else there, a flicker of uncertainty. He looked around at the few customers still lingering, but no one spoke. His granddaughter, Emily, had been quietly watching the scene from behind the counter, her phone in her hand. She had been recording the entire incident, her eyes wide with discomfort. She didn't speak up, but the weight of the moment lingered in her mind. Later that night, after the protests outside the store began to gain momentum, the video of what had happened went viral. Emily had shared it online, and before long, it had caught fire. People from all over the country were outraged at Frank's actions. In the town, a group of young activists organized a protest in front of Delaney's market. The streets were filled with chants of accountability now and end racism. And though some of the town's older residents defended Frank, Many were uneasy. Some whispered about how Frank had the right to refuse service to anyone, but others couldn't ignore the injustice of it all. The next day, Frank's world started to unravel. His store, once a fixture in the community, was now a symbol of division and hate. His regular customers, the ones who had kept him in business for years, began to turn their backs on him. They walked past the store, refusing to step inside, even as Frank tried to dismiss the growing outrage. He muttered to himself, "People are too sensitive these days." But Emily, who had been uncomfortable with her grandfather's actions from the start, couldn't stay silent any longer. She confronted him, her voice trembling with emotion. "Grandpa, do you see what's happening? You can't just judge people because of the color of their skin. You don't even know him." Frank tried to brush it off, but Emily's words hit him harder than he wanted to admit. The damage was already done. People were starting to ask questions. Was Frank really the kind of person he wanted to be? Was this how he wanted to be remembered? Meanwhile, Marcus was having an entirely different experience. As the news coverage spread, he was invited to speak on national television, where he shared his side of the story. Calm and composed, Marcus addressed the public, not just about his experience but about the larger issue of racism. "This isn't just about me," Marcus said, his voice steady but full of conviction. "This is about the people who face this kind of treatment every single day. I'm lucky enough that the cameras were rolling when this happened, but how many others are silenced because they don't have a platform?" Frank sat at home, watching Marcus on TV, his heart sinking as the realization hit him. The man he had kicked out of his store was someone who had donated millions to underprivileged communities, who had inspired countless people with his work, and who had earned the respect of everyone who knew him. And Frank had humiliated him in front of his community. The weight of his actions began to sink in, and for the first time, Frank felt the sting of shame. But even as he began to feel regret, the damage was already done. The protests outside Delaney's market continued to grow, and people started to demand accountability. Frank's store, once a symbol of tradition, now stood as a reminder of his bigotry. Customers began boycotting, and his business, once steady, now faced closure. Frank found himself alone, the weight of his choices bearing down on him. The protests outside the store grew louder, and in the quiet of his office, Frank knew that his actions had destroyed everything he had worked for. His reputation was tarnished, his community was turning against him, and his business was on the brink of collapse. Emily, who had been quietly supportive of Marcus from the beginning, had become a vocal advocate for change. Frank's own granddaughter had turned against him, and the realization hit him like a ton of bricks. His ignorance had led to his downfall. Outside, the protesters continued to chant. Frank stood by the window, looking at the empty store, knowing that his life would never be the same. And then, for the first time in his life, he understood the full weight of what he had done. He had hurt someone who had done nothing but try to help others. He had destroyed his own legacy because of his inability to see beyond his prejudices. In the end, Frank's actions didn't just hurt Marcus, they destroyed him. And as Marcus stood tall in the face of it all, his dignity intact, the true lesson emerged. Racism, at its core, not only hurts the victim but destroys the perpetrator as well. And for Frank Delaney, the realization came too late. But for Marcus, the fight wasn't over. His work continued, his advocacy grew louder, and his voice became a beacon for those who had been silenced for too long. As Frank stood in front of his empty store, he watched the screen, tears welling in his eyes as Marcus delivered a message of hope, compassion, and change. And Frank finally understood. As Frank stood in the dim light of his empty store, the words on the TV felt like a heavy weight pressing down on him. He had always thought of himself as a good man, someone who worked hard for what he had, who was respected in the community. But now, as he watched Marcus read, someone he had so carelessly humiliated, speaking with such grace, Frank couldn't deny the truth anymore. On the screen, Marcus was finishing his message, his words reaching through the screen, quiet yet powerful. We all have a choice to embrace kindness, to choose understanding over hate. It doesn't matter where you come from, what your skin looks like, or how much money you have. What matters is how you treat people, how you show up in the world, Marcus's words echoed in Frank's mind, each syllable cutting deeper into his shame. This wasn't just about the store or the town. It was about a fundamental failure to see the humanity in others. Frank had thought that his little corner of the world was untouched, immune to the complexities of race and prejudice. But now, with everything crumbling around him, he realized how wrong he had been. The protests outside Delaney's market had become a fixture. Every day, more people gathered, holding signs demanding accountability. The town that had once turned a blind eye to the subtle prejudices that had defined their lives now found itself forced to confront the truth. Frank's store, a symbol of tradition and community, had become the center of that reckoning. Emily, Frank's granddaughter, was now a prominent figure at the protests. She had become a voice for change, her once quiet discomfort with her grandfather's actions now replaced by a fierce determination to see things right. She was using her platform, her social media following, to advocate for change, to ensure that Frank's mistakes wouldn't be forgotten. Her relationship with Frank had become strained. Though she still loved him, she couldn't reconcile the man she had known with the one who had publicly humiliated Marcus. She had tried talking to him, pleading with him to see reason, but Frank's pride had held him back, at least until the weight of public opinion began to crush him. One night, after Emily had returned from a rally, she found her grandfather sitting at the kitchen table, his face drawn and tired. His hands trembled as he stared at a letter from his bank, a notice that the store's loan was overdue, that he was facing imminent foreclosure. It was the final nail in the coffin. The store he had built with his own hands, the one that had been passed down from his father and grandfather, was slipping away. "Grandpa," Emily said, her voice gentle but firm, "this isn't just about the store. It's about everything that happened. You humiliated someone who didn't deserve it. You let your own fear and ignorance dictate your actions, and now we're paying the price. The town is changing, Grandpa, and if you want to be a part of that change, you have to own up to what you did." Frank didn't respond at first. The words stung, but they were true. He had spent so many years in his own bubble, thinking that he was in control, that the world would bend to his will. But now, everything was falling apart. His granddaughter, who had once been a child full of laughter and innocence, was now a young woman who was willing to stand up for what was right, even if it meant standing up to him. The shame of it all settled over Frank like a thick fog. He had always prided himself on being a man who stood by his beliefs, but now his beliefs were nothing more than a defense mechanism against the uncomfortable truths he had spent his life avoiding. "I never meant for it to go this far," Frank said quietly, his voice cracking. I didn't think anyone would care." "People care because it's wrong, Grandpa," Emily replied softly. "You hurt someone. You hurt all of us. And you have to make it right." Frank looked at her, his eyes filled with regret, but also something else, a flicker of understanding, as if a part of him was finally awakening to the reality of what he had done. He was tired of hiding behind his prejudice, tired of clinging to his outdated beliefs. But was it too late for him to change? Could he redeem himself? The next day, Frank stood in front of his store, watching the protesters outside. He saw their faces, their signs, and he realized something profound. These were the faces of the future. The town was changing, for better or worse. And for once, he didn't know if he could stop it. But maybe he didn't have to. Maybe it was time to stop resisting and start listening. Inside, the shelves were bare. The store had lost most of its customers, the once bustling aisles now quiet. Frank had done everything he could to keep the store open, but the community had spoken, and the people had decided. The tide of progress couldn't be stopped by the stubbornness of one man. And in a way, Frank knew he had brought this on himself. He had let his prejudice define him for too long, and now it was his legacy. Emily, sensing her grandfather's quiet despair, stood beside him. She didn't say anything at first, but Frank could feel her presence, steady and strong. "I don't know if I can make up for everything I've done," Frank said, his voice barely a whisper. "You can start by owning up to it," Emily replied, her voice gentle. "You can start by telling people the truth." The following week, Frank did something he never thought he'd do. He stepped in front of the local news cameras and issued a public apology. The words were difficult for him to say, but they were honest. He admitted to his prejudice, his mistakes, and his ignorance. He acknowledged the harm he had caused Marcus Reed and everyone who had been affected by his actions. "I was wrong," Frank said, his voice steady but filled with regret. "And I will do whatever I can to make it right, to learn, to grow, and to understand that we are all equal, no matter our skin color. I let fear control my actions, and I hurt someone who didn't deserve it. I can't undo what I've done, but I can change moving forward. I'm sorry." The apology didn't fix everything. The store wasn't going to magically reopen, and Frank couldn't erase the damage he had caused. But it was a start. For the first time, he was acknowledging the truth, and that was more than he had ever been willing to do before. As Frank stood there, his heart heavy but relieved, he realized that the road to redemption wouldn't be easy. It would take time, effort, and real change. But for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. Marcus, watching the news from his office, saw Frank's apology. He felt a mixture of emotions, relief, perhaps, but also something more. The apology didn't change the past, but it was a step toward healing. It was a sign that even the most stubborn of hearts could change if given the right circumstances. And that was something worth holding on to. The weeks that followed were marked by small but significant shifts. The town began to slowly heal from the divisiveness that had once seemed so entrenched. People who had been silent during the protests now began to speak out, acknowledging the need for change. It wasn't immediate, change never is, but there was a noticeable difference in the air. The atmosphere felt lighter, as if people were starting to realize that the collective strength of a community comes not from preserving the status quo, but from embracing the voices and stories of everyone within it. Frank, meanwhile, had taken Emily's advice to heart. He spent his days trying to learn more, reading books on history, on race relations, on the struggles that people like Marcus and many others faced every day. He sought out conversations, even if they were uncomfortable, with people who could open his eyes to the world outside the bubble he had created. It was awkward at times, even painful, but Frank was determined to do the work. He started attending the community meetings where people discussed the future of the town, focusing especially on the issues of racism and inequality that had been swept under the rug for so long. It was there, at one such meeting, that he found himself face to face with Marcus Reed once more. Marcus had agreed to meet with Frank, not out of a sense of obligation, but because he genuinely believed that change was possible. Despite everything that had happened, Marcus had never lost his faith in the idea that people could evolve, that even those who had caused harm could come to understand and repair the damage they had done. When Frank walked into the community center, he felt a wave of self-consciousness flood over him. He had seen Marcus on television, had heard the words he spoke, but standing in front of him, face to face, felt different. Marcus's reputation preceded him. He was known far and wide for his generosity, his philanthropy, and his unwavering dedication to equality. He had earned the respect of so many, and yet here was Frank, just a man trying to find a way to make things right. "Marcus," Frank said, extending his hand, his voice tentative, "I owe you an apology. I'm not sure if it means anything, but I want you to know that I am genuinely sorry for what I did. For everything." Marcus studied him for a moment. There was no anger in his eyes, just a quiet intensity. Then he shook Frank's hand, his grip firm but not aggressive. "I appreciate that, Frank. I can't say it's easy to forgive, but I understand. The hardest part is acknowledging that the harm was done in the first place. You've done that, and now the real work begins." Frank nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of those words. "What can I do to make up for it?" he asked, his voice full of sincerity. "I know it won't fix everything, but I want to try." Marcus thought for a moment, then spoke with a calm that belied the emotions he must have been feeling. "You've already started, Frank, by being here, by listening, and by changing your mindset. But it's more than just apologizing. It's about showing up every day for your community, for the people who need help, for the people who have been overlooked." Frank took a deep breath, absorbing Marcus's words. He had been so focused on trying to fix his mistake that he hadn't fully understood what needed to be done to move forward. This was more than a single act of redemption. It was a lifetime of work. Over the next few months, Frank's life changed. He continued attending community meetings, offering his time to support initiatives aimed at creating more equity in the town. He worked alongside local activists to improve access to education, healthcare, and jobs for marginalized communities. Frank even became involved with Marcus's charity, helping to raise funds and awareness for programs that supported at-risk youth. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of discomfort, moments when Frank caught himself slipping back into old habits, moments when he felt like the weight of the past was too heavy to overcome. But every time he faltered, he reminded himself that this was the work he needed to do. That change wasn't something that happened overnight. It was something built through consistent, humble effort. Emily, too, had found herself growing as a person. She had started an advocacy group at school, focusing on racial justice and equality. Her peers, many of whom had been silent at first, were beginning to speak out, to challenge their own assumptions, to push for a more inclusive community. Emily's group began organizing town-wide events, town halls, and education campaigns to raise awareness about the impact of racism and the importance of allyship. One evening, as Frank and Emily sat on the porch of their house, watching the sunset, Emily turned to her grandfather. "I'm proud of you, Grandpa," she said quietly. "I know it wasn't easy, and it's not over yet. But you've done something important. You've changed." Frank smiled softly, his heart full of gratitude. "I'm proud of you too, Emily. You've been a force for good in this town. You've made people listen." Emily paused, her gaze distant. "I think we're all still learning, but we're getting there." And that was true. They were getting there, slowly, yes, but surely. They were learning to listen to each other, to acknowledge the pain of the past and the promise of the future. They were learning that change wasn't a destination, but a journey. A journey that required everyone to participate, to do the hard work, and to never stop fighting for justice and equality. Frank had learned a painful lesson in humility, and in the process, he had learned something even more valuable: the power of redemption, the power of change, and the power of understanding. As he stood at the edge of his store, now closed for good, he thought about everything he had lost, but more importantly, everything he had gained. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in his life, Frank didn't feel lost. He felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be, facing forward, ready to continue the work he had started, ready to make the world a better place, one step at a time. The days turned into weeks, and the momentum of change began to build steadily. Frank found himself walking down streets he once avoided, attending meetings in places that felt unfamiliar to him, but were now a vital part of his new reality. He no longer saw the world through the narrow lens of his former prejudices, but rather through a more expansive one. One that encompassed not only the challenges of others, but also the strength and resilience they had in overcoming them. As part of his efforts to make amends, Frank began hosting community dinners at the now vacant lot where Delaney's market used to stand. The dinners were open to everyone, with a focus on unity, healing, and progress. They became a safe space where people could speak openly about their experiences and learn from one another. What began as a small, quiet gathering gradually turned into a popular event, attracting people from all walks of life: Black, white, Hispanic, Asian, and more. The food was good, the conversation was better, and slowly but surely, people started seeing the value of coming together. Emily played a crucial role in this transformation, too. She helped organize guest speakers, coordinated youth outreach programs, and led workshops on anti-racism and allyship. Her leadership was undeniable, and she became a voice of reason for many in the town who hadn't been able to move past the incidents of the past. As much as she had distanced herself from her grandfather's beliefs, she now saw that true progress could only be made when everyone, no matter how small the step, was moving forward together. One particular evening, as Emily was setting up for the dinner, she pulled Frank aside. There was something in her eyes that made Frank stop what he was doing. "Grandpa," she began, her voice earnest, "there's something I've been thinking about for a while now. We've done a lot here in the community, and we've made real progress. But there's one thing I think we can do to really make a lasting impact. What if we made the community dinners more than just a gathering? What if we made them an official foundation? We could create a scholarship fund for young people who want to pursue higher education but can't afford it. We could build partnerships with local businesses to give back to the community that has supported us. We could make this not just about talking, but about action. Frank listened intently, his heart swelling with pride. He had always known Emily had a vision far beyond the scope of what anyone expected from a teenager. But this idea, was exactly what they needed. He hadn't considered turning the dinners into something more official, but now that she mentioned it, it felt like the perfect way to cement the legacy of their efforts. "I love that idea, Emily," Frank said, his voice thick with emotion. "I think it's time to take this to the next level. Let's do it." And so, with Emily's help, Frank started the Delaney Foundation. It was a testament to their shared vision, a foundation dedicated to promoting education, racial equality, and community empowerment. They gathered support from local businesses, churches, and individuals who shared their passion for social justice. The first major fundraiser was held at the very same community dinners that Frank had started. But this time, the event was bigger, more organized, and aimed at raising funds for scholarships and grants that would provide opportunities to young people in the town, regardless of their background. The launch of the foundation marked a turning point in the town's story. Frank had gone from a figure of suspicion and resentment to one of community leadership, even though it wasn't easy. He still faced moments of doubt and frustration, times when the weight of his past seemed too heavy to bear. But with each success, no matter how small, he realized that it wasn't about erasing his mistakes. It was about showing the world, and himself, that people could change, grow, and contribute to something greater than their past. Marcus Reed remained a close ally and advisor to the foundation, helping to ensure that the initiatives Frank and Emily worked on were grounded in authenticity and purpose. Marcus continued his work as a philanthropist, using his platform to highlight the voices of those who had been historically silenced. His work and Frank's work became intertwined, their mutual respect for one another growing with each passing day. The town, though still imperfect, had begun to truly transform. What had once been a place where people stayed within their comfort zones, clinging to familiar prejudices, was now a town where people were beginning to question, to listen, to grow. It wasn't just a shift in attitude. It was a cultural change that would last for generations to come. For Frank, the most rewarding part of the journey came when he received a letter one afternoon. It was from a young man, a high school senior, who had been one of the first to receive a scholarship from the Delaney Foundation. The letter expressed gratitude not only for the financial support, but for the opportunity to change his own path in life. The young man had come from a family of limited means, with few opportunities. But now, thanks to the foundation, he had been accepted into a top university on a full scholarship. His words were simple but powerful. "You didn't just change my life, you changed my entire family's future. Thank you." As Frank read the letter, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This was what redemption looked like. Not just through apologies and words, but through actions, through tangible, real change. He had lost his store, but in the process, he had found something even more important, a way to leave a legacy that would outlive him. As the months continued, the community dinners expanded. They became a symbol of the town's commitment to bridging divides, fostering understanding, and ensuring that the mistakes of the past would not define the future. The town, once divided and plagued by ignorance, had found a new sense of unity. Frank had learned, as he stood before the gathered crowd one evening, that while racism may never be fully eradicated, understanding, dialogue, and forgiveness were the most powerful tools they had. The work was ongoing, and it always would be, but the progress was undeniable. The town was healing, and so was Frank. As the final community dinner of the year approached, the evening was charged with an energy of celebration and reflection. The weather was crisp, and the smell of freshly grilled food filled the air as people gathered at the open space where Delaney's market once stood. Tables were adorned with flowers, candles, and the glow of lights strung up between the trees. It was more than just a dinner now. It was a testament to everything the town had worked to rebuild and to all that had been learned from the painful lessons of the past. Frank stood off to the side, watching as people mingled, laughed, and shared stories. Emily was at the front, speaking to a group of young activists who had helped shape the town's ongoing transformation. She'd grown into a strong, articulate young woman whose passion for justice and change had only deepened with time. Marcus Reed was there too, as was the young man from the first scholarship award. The young man, now in his first year of college, was home for the holidays and had come to thank the community for helping him get this far. His presence was a symbol of everything that had been accomplished, an individual, empowered by education and opportunity, now able to give back. At the podium, Frank was introduced by Emily. As he stepped up, there was a brief moment of silence, a moment where everything he had gone through, everything he had learned, seemed to hang in the air. He took a deep breath, looked out over the crowd, and began to speak. "I never thought this day would come. There was a time when I thought I had everything figured out, that my way of seeing the world was the right way. But I was wrong, and I can't undo the hurt I caused, the ignorance I held. But what I can do, what all of us can do, is work together to create a better future. A future where we see each other for who we are, not the color of our skin, not the history we carry, but the people we are becoming." The crowd was silent, listening intently. Frank's voice cracked slightly as he continued. "I've seen the power of change in my own life. I've seen it in the faces of those who've stood by me. But more importantly, I've seen it in this community. We've made mistakes, but we've learned, we've grown, and we've found strength in each other." Frank paused and looked toward Emily, who was watching with pride. He continued, his words heavier with meaning. "I may never fully make up for the past, but I'll spend the rest of my life working to make sure that the next generation doesn't have to live with the same divisions we did. To the young people here tonight, you are our hope. You are the change we've been waiting for." The crowd erupted in applause, and Frank felt a tear slip down his cheek. It was a tear of relief, of healing. He was finally at peace with himself, knowing that the work of redemption was not a one-time event, but a lifelong journey. As the evening continued, people shared stories, danced, and celebrated not just the progress they had made, but the promise of a future where love and understanding prevailed. The town that had once been divided by hatred was now united by a common purpose, to build a world where racism no longer had a place, where everyone could thrive. Frank and Emily stood together near the edge of the gathering, looking out at the sea of people who had come to this moment of healing. Emily turned to her grandfather, her voice soft but filled with conviction. "We've come a long way, Grandpa, and we're not done yet, but we're on the right path." Frank nodded, a faint smile crossing his face. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. Hopeful for the town, for his family, and for himself. The night sky above them was dotted with stars, and as the final song played in the background, Frank felt a sense of peace that he had longed for. It wasn't a perfect ending, and it never would be, but it was the beginning of something beautiful, something that could grow and evolve with each passing day. And as the music faded, Frank knew that, in the end, it wasn't about what he had lost, but about what he had gained. The chance to make things right, to heal, and to leave behind a legacy that would inspire generations to come. And with that, the story came full circle, ending not with an apology, but with action, growth, and the promise of a brighter tomorrow. Share your thoughts in the comments. Like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more inspiring stories.